Okay, got it.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for joining us. Can you please state your name and where you currently live?
My name is Charlotte Gordon, and I live in Norman, Oklahoma, University Town.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Can you tell me who is your Choctaw or Chickasaw ancestor and who enslaved them if you have that information?
I do have that information thanks to my father, who was the local historian. I was able to not only listen to him, but I was also able to go back and do some research on my own. My Choctaw freedman, enslaved person and ancestor is Rachel Brown. She is my second great grandmother on my maternal side, on my mother's side.
Did you hear of her name? Was her name familiar to you when you were younger?
Her name was familiar to me only through my dad. I did forget to tell you though that she was enslaved by Campbell LaFleur.
Mm.
I'm still looking to see if actually the current LaFleur County was named for some of his ancestors, for some of his descendants, I should say, or for him. So I'm still trying to see how that county came about its name. But I heard about Rachel, not through my mother, but through my dad, who was not a freedman. They ventured this way by way of Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. But he was very in tune to the history of the country in which he was making a living.
Right. Very, very interesting in and of itself. You yourself are from LaFleur County, correct?
I am from LaFleur County, town of Spiro, but from the township and community of Fort Coffee, Oklahoma. I wanted to put all that in because the history of which I'm more familiar is with Fort Coffee, with the community, with the history, with all of its abundance, with just the history that's involved with all of Fort Coffee, not Spiro.
Right, right. And that area was part of the old Skullyville District in the Choctaw Nation at one time.
Skullyville, Oak Lodge.
Yes.
That territory, yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned your ancestor, Rachel Brown. And of course, which we can talk about that a little bit later. Of course, many of the individuals were allotted land. Her old land allotment rests on a very significant spot, doesn't it?
Currently, the Spiro Mounds, again, the city was named after the natives that were there. The Spiro Mounds Museum actually rests on part of her allotment, her son's allotment, her grandchildren's allotment, and some of those direct descendants of her son Rufus, they're still located in that area. A few are still located in that area.
Wow, absolutely amazing. Well, you may have heard a few things certainly about her or the area from your father. How did you come to get more closely involved with this history yourself?
Well, I have to commend you on your Facebook post. Not only did I begin learning more and more through my dad, but you especially with your online presence has made it more available to me. And so this is how I've become to dig deeper into my history. But I started looking into the research papers at the Oklahoma Historical Society after getting a good journey. You all teaching me the trails to make, how to go about this journey, because our history is very difficult. And if one is not of present mind to continue digging and digging and digging, because it's a lot of work that goes into it, then we won't know much more than just present it to us. And unless our ancestors, unless our parents, grandparents really have talked that up, we won't have that history. There was a code of silence there for a while, or I don't know if it's a code of silence or just people just trying to make the best way that they could with what they had.
Very interesting. At some point in time, as you were hearing about your ancestors, about Rachel Brown and others, did you ever hear about them in relation to something called the Dawes Roll?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have to always keep referring back to my dad, because he was the letter writer. He was the one who wanted more information. So when he passed in 2000, I went through some of his old paperwork and actually saw where he had applied to get a copy of the roll number. My mom went to Muskogee at one time to get her roll number based on her dad being enrolled as a freedman. So that's how I began to get really interested in, what is she talking about? What are they talking about? What is this freedman? Then what happens with a lot of African-American people is that because they hear the word Indian roll, they automatically and falsely, for the most part, align themselves as natives.
Mhm.
They are not. That's where the distinction comes in as to by blood or freedmen. Well, there's just so much to discern. And so immediately, the first thing they think about is, oh, I have Indian blood. And that's mostly always false.
When you began to learn more about what freedmen meant, the word freedmen, obviously it's describing a classification given to people who were freed from something.
Yes.
That something was enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware of chattel slavery being practiced in the community at one point where you grew up, where your ancestors are from? Had you come to understand that Rachel Brown, whose name you had heard, had at one time, she and or her family had been enslaved?
Owned. And that's,
Yes. Did you know
yes,
that growing up?
I did know that. I knew it only by the way the property was put in her name and why it was. We always, my mom and dad had 10 children. There was always this time in the evenings after he's been working all day that he would talk to us about the acreages that were allotted, about the choice. This is one thing that really bothered him a lot, about the choice that were given to some uneducated people, whether to take money
Oh yes, we've heard
or
about that. Yeah.
property.
Mhm.
And so he would always say, God doesn't make any more land. So what you get is what you keep. What you're able to obtain is what you keep. So to answer your question, yes, I did know about that. My dad used to talk about how smart she was in obtaining property, not only for herself, but for her son, who had to be somewhere else for a little while, not there in person. He spent some time in Leavenworth.
Yeah.
But she was sure, as a matter of fact, I have her papers in which she represented her son in obtaining his property.
Wow. When you look at her story, you see that she had been enslaved by Campbell LaFleur, correct?
Campbell LaFleur.
Were you surprised to see that the slaveholder was not the typical slaveholder that many people of African descent have, meaning a Southern white man owned people enslaved? This was
Right.
not a white man from Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee. This is a man who was citizen of an indigenous community.
Mhm.
What was your reaction?
Once again, I have to say I wasn't surprised. The community in which we live were mostly African Americans and Native Americans. So I wasn't surprised because once again, we were at our dad's knees and he's telling us that not only were they granted their freedom after the emancipation, but they were granted it later. So those kind of things I knew because of the conversations that we would have sitting at his feet, but also the anger that he had about it. But the community, because it was mostly African American, but we did have natives that still lived there. And the names were very familiar. The people, especially the Ainsworth, they live less than 3 miles.
Right.
And their property is still less than 3 miles from my homestead. So that's how we first learned about it, just by listening to his stories. And I think he became more and more, like I said, yes, he grew up there, but his folks did not. So he became more and more interested in the property. And the other thing is that he knew that my great auntie had chosen to take money instead of land, then wanted to come back years later to get property, but without understanding how much money was, how far it could go,
Right.
and so on. So
very interesting. I'm curious. You learned a lot from your father.
yes.
Your mother's side, however, was the side that a lot of this is pertaining to. And as you begin to learn more, or as people begin to talk and share family history information, what was the reaction of members of the family as they began to comprehend some of this story?
The members of my family,
of your paternal side, since this is on your mother's side.
There are still quite a few surnamed Browns that still live in the area. Browns and Brewers and Smiths and so on. That group was not very well learned. Education didn't seem to be as important as it was to my paternal side. So along that line, several of the Browns were mostly matriarchal. Most of the women were in charge. Not that many men who were Browns or on that side took much interest in the history or of preserving the history. So like everything I learned about my grandmother, my dad told me. My mom was very, she obtained a 4th grade education. She was one of 2 siblings. My grandfather was rarely home. So it was mostly my mom and her mom. So mostly everything was done by the women. They had a real close connection, the Brown women. They had a real close personal connection. They sang together, they ate together, they did lots of things together, but books and further learning and academia, those were not the first things on their minds.
Interesting. How has exploring this history, first of all, you're coming from an historic town as well. Fort Coffee has fascinating history. There were interesting people who lived and who passed through your community frequently
Yes,
since
yes.
the inception of the town, when it was originally Swallow Rock, which was one of the old names of the community. But how has this affected you in terms of looking at your hometown, your community, your county of origin?
For me, it's produced an urgency. It's produced an urgency in me because I feel that my biological children need to know their history on both sides, but especially where I grew up. So it's not only produced an urgency in me, I want them to know all of the neighbors that were there. It's the history there is not just people that passed down the road and not knowing from where they came and the hardships and the things that they had to overcome to acquire what they did. That's my urgency. You need to know why you have this property. You need to know how they came to obtain it. You need to know how tenacious your ancestors were. You need to know what they had to overcome. Now, if they know all that, that will help them to want to preserve everything that they fought for, they got, and that they kept.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm passionate about it.
Wow. Well, as you talk about that, what have you done, I guess, since this became more frequently a part of the things that you're interested in? This passion has arisen in with you. So either what have you done or what are you planning to do with this? Something has clearly been stimulated.
Yes, yeah.
So where do you want to take that energy?
Well, we are, I'm currently making sure that I tap into my ancestry so that I could leave something for them to actually put their hands on, all in one place. Right now, I'm searching at different websites and online areas, just like you're doing and continue to do for different people. I'm trying to pull it all together in that my kids and my grandkids will have something to put their hands on. Then they can say, look at what our ancestors accomplished through all their hardships. Look at what they did. Look at what they kept.
Yeah.
That's so my delving into what my ancestors did, it allows me to save something for history. But it's not only my personal history. What it should do for these who are more academically inclined is to allow them to share the history of what we're going through, of what has been gone through, and that, African Americans are a viable part of Oklahoma. Yes. We were not thought of all of a sudden. We were here before statehood. We weren't always here in our own terms. There were quite a few of us, but we weren't always here in our own terms. And this is why it's important for us to be a part of the history that is Oklahoma.
In light of that, what you're just saying, and I know that you've worked as an educator for many years as well. We're talking about history that is not complete. If you ask people about some aspects of African American history in the state of Oklahoma, you'll hear about something that happened in 1921 in Tulsa. You may hear about some towns that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. But you're part of a community where people of African descent have lived 9 decades before statehood, back to the 1830s onward. And yet, within the educational system, the fact that many came into the territory as people enslaved, but that's not even taught, that slavery occurred on the soil of what is now the state of Oklahoma, where you are. What do you make of that, or how do you reconcile that as you're going forward and looking at things and you know it's not taught?
There really is no way to reconcile it. However, you and I both know that those people who are in charge, that's the history they'll put forth. They will add to, they will omit. But those are the ones who are in charge. And those who were in charge were the Caucasians. They might have been mixed a little bit with Native, or those who settled the territory. If you look at Oklahoma history textbooks, you don't see a lot of Native history in it either. So up until about 4 or 5 years ago, in the Oklahoma textbooks were still glorifying the land run as if no one was here. It took African Americans and Native Americans working together to change that thought, to change the writing in the textbooks. So again, the Native Americans couldn't have done it without us getting all that change. We helped to change the narrative. Now we need them to help change our narrative.
And of course, it's important that we tell our story. Yes. What, I guess at this point, are your plans going forward, knowing your history, not just to the land mass that became Oklahoma and your particular corner of what became Oklahoma in eastern Oklahoma, LaFleur County, but you know that there are ties that your family has, very well documented ties as citizens of the Choctaw Nation. As you move forward with that, what are your plans going forward as you know that history and as you engage with others who share that history? What do you plan to do with that?
Well, personally, what I've done is I have sent off to get paperwork for my family and myself. It has been denied. It's okay. I have that as a trail. I have sent messages to the chiefs. We're still just on a personal level. I just want to make sure that we're being seen, we're being heard, we're not being forgotten. The chief of the nation should understand we won't be going away. We will continue. There's so much to do. I really don't have, I have to confess, I don't have a straight answer for what I will personally do, because there's so much to be done. But I will continue to make sure that we are being seen, we're being heard, and ultimately, by the grace of God and by their good senses and their sense of fairness, the tribes will allow us to become citizens of the nation of which we were already citizens of in the first place.
Have you mentioned that you've communicated with Principal Chief Batten himself.
Batten.
Have you received a response from his office or from?
I have not.
You have not.
I have not. The only response I received was from when I applied for my citizenship. And of course, they said that it had to be citizen by blood. And that was the refusal.
I guess it's an interesting concept because the United States did not prevent citizenship for formerly enslaved people because they did not have the slave owners' blood.
Exactly.
But that is the practice of several federally recognized tribes, of which your tax dollars fund. But I understand.
Exactly. Exactly.
Correct. And of course, you have a historic and documented tie, as do many of us. And most importantly, there are rich stories. And you're coming from an historic town. So many opportunities to preserve that history and preserve those landmarks as well. So I'm thrilled that you're willing to tell your story as well. Is there anything else that you would like to add that maybe I haven't asked that you might say, gee, I wish she had asked me this so I could tell her that? Anything else?
You know, I can't think of anything that we haven't covered. I just know that that community was one in which no matter how academically inclined they were, it was a community of people who worked together for the good of others. As I've gone through and gone down different rabbit holes and my research, you know, I found relatives that I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't know how they were related. So the relationship is there. Now, what that does for me, and I hope what it does for my kids, for my grandchildren, is to say, we are a strong folk.
Yes.
We are strong. And not only that, we know how to build. We know how to make better. All we need is opportunity and for people to be just in addressing us and doing what they need to do and making sure that they do their part. I've looked at my grandmother on my grandmother's side and seeing how I'm related to so many others in the community and how that's come about. So maybe it's an age thing. Maybe I'm getting to to the point in my life that I know that connections are so important.
I'm curious in terms of, as you're even reflecting, yes, where you are, where many of us are in our lives, in terms of not just being reflective, but also sharing some of the things that have come to us. Of course, you were very fortunate to have, certainly your father was really, it sounds like he was pretty meticulous in terms of going after this history and going after this data. And
yes.
You yourself have gone through that process of trying to make a connection to the nation that's part of your birthright. You're born there, right there on the soil.
Yes, in the house.
Right, literally. And I think though there's maybe an opportunity to influence others in terms of saying, hey, let's open the door to this door that's been closed for a long time.
Yes.
And not just in terms of whether or not the tribe itself is going to respond. There's a tremendous door in terms of history that has to be, number one, has to be discovered again. Thankfully, it's documented, but now it has to be told. And which is why I'm just delighted that someone such as yourself, who also sees the value of it and the impact that sharing this information can have. And wow, this is something, and I certainly hope that you do get a response from Durant, and that you will be able to well, pass something down to your children and grandchildren because of your own actions in preserving the history and the history of Choctaw freedmen. And so,
May I ask, may I interject also that I have to say the interest of the community members that are down still in Fort Coffee, the interest is there. The hard work is some of the things that kind of stop some people. They love to ask, now how are your parents related to my parents? And so the interest is there. The hard work is one of the things, and this is hard work.
it is.
Because again, the history was written by those who had the power.
And it was omitted by the same. Yeah.
And was omitted by the same. So now we can get that power if everyone would just close ranks and let's just do this history, and we can present it the way it was.
I have another final question, I guess, for you. Having grown up in a community like Fort Coffee and growing up in a county like LaFleur County, of course, you've known many people, obviously, of different backgrounds.
Yes.
It's certainly, if you draw a 50-mile radius and put Fort Coffee in the middle, you're going to have people from multiple backgrounds. You're
Yes.
going to have native Choctaw people in, and what I mean, Choctaws by blood, although
Yes.
I'm not sure how blood is measured. You don't really,
Well,
it's something that is practiced as a policy and something that's the most unscientific thing. How does one measure blood? But nevertheless, you've known people who have native background. Your
yes.
ancestors, Rachel had to speak Choctaw to get things done. And
Mhm.
her parents certainly had to, as enslaved
Yes.
people, to be able to continue to live and not be sold away. So
Mhm.
as you look at the people and the diversity of the people, and you used the word fairness earlier, did you, in your experience growing up in a Choctaw, certainly designated area, did you interact with Native people? Do you find that you know Native people today? And I'm saying Native people, keeping in mind that many freedmen referred to themselves as natives, and they weren't saying that they were, they weren't all Folsoms or LaFleurs or Perrys.
Right.
They were certainly Choctaw freedmen because they were not Georgia freedmen. So,
Right. Right.
they were, this is who they were. They were
Mhm.
immersed in that culture. You yourself, growing up in that community, over the years, have you come to see any type of interaction as the years have passed, or in contrast to what you saw growing up? Or was there, due to forced segregation, was there a separation of communities? Because at one point, the communities were one community.
Well, once again, my grandfather on my paternal side was one of the larger farmers there in that area. So he had borders. He took in people during the Depression and fed them, put them to work. Now,
Who were they? I mean, were these?
they were Black people or people who just kind of traveled the area. So he took them in. On a couple of my census information, I do have some of their names. But in farming, there were many natives who worked for my grandfather. Again, that was on my paternal side. Now, with my father, who had acquired land after he and my mom got married, the surname Gist of several native families, GIST,
Yeah.
they just lived up the corner from us. We worked together, we played together. And segregation for that, integration for that little part of the town, that came pretty early. That came before the mandates came, but it came in dribs and drabs. I went to a segregated grade school up until 8th grade. My brother and sister, my 2 oldest siblings, they went through a segregated school the whole time. My 3rd and 4th oldest siblings, they went to an integrated school from 9th grade to 12th grade. So our interactions and intermingling in the schools, that was early on. My youngest 2 brothers, integrated school. I went from 9th grade to high school being integrated. So the difference came when we got around other people. We didn't mingle with the natives. They didn't mingle with us. They kind of mingled with their own. So it really was kind of an African-American community, Native community, white community.
Interesting, especially if one is to turn back the clock maybe a century, things were a little bit different. And
okay, I'm going to have you to repeat that question.
Okay,
I think you
so
froze
sorry.
on me a little. Would you repeat that, please?
Sure. I said, your point was interesting, especially if we turn back the clock 100 years, things were a little different. And now, 100 years later, we're now strangers. Although we all came together, we traveled together, lived on the same land, granted not in the same status, but we're together. And things are a little bit different, but you've made some excellent points. Any final words?
I just thank you so much for inviting me to share what I know and to continue to energize me and invigorate me in my planning and what I'd like to see. I just appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you taking certainly time out from your schedule and of course for participating in the Choctaw Chickasaw Freedmen Association Oral History Project. This is something that we are part of the first generation of those who are discovering this unwritten history and undocumented history. So certainly I want to just thank you for being our guest. And I hope we talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Real soon. Thank you.